It's great to be here this evening and to speak to you all about an exhibition that's currently open at the British Museum and that has a few weeks left of the exhibition. So I hope this presentation is useful if you've already visited the exhibition, but I also hope it will be useful if you haven't visited the exhibition, or even if you never do. I hope there's something in it that you'll find of interest and value. The exhibition has brought together objects from across museums across Britain and Europe, and we have around 32 different lenders. I think this is probably the first and then perhaps the last time that such a range of objects will be brought together in London for an exhibition about this time period, with the rising costs of loans and the logistical problems that we face in bringing such valuable and precious and fragile objects. It's probably a rare occasion when all these objects will be shown together, but it's really only been possible because of the cooperation with my colleagues in museums right across Britain, in sometimes quite small museums with limited resource, and indeed across Europe and our continental colleagues. So really, I think I always want to start by saying that although tonight I'll talk about the British Museum's exhibition, the museum is only able to put on this show because of the collaboration and the cooperation of so many different regional partners. But many of us feel that Stonehenge is a familiar site. Perhaps we visited as school children, or perhaps we have taken our children there to see the stones, or indeed perhaps we've just passed it on the A303 on the way to our holidays in Devon and Cornwall. It's a familiar sight as we sometimes sit in traffic jams on that road. But really what the exhibition is trying to do is to build on that familiarity, to take Stonehenge and say, yes, this is an iconic site. It's recognized perhaps across the world as a very important site. But how much do we, as a British public, I suppose, know about the time period? And I think most particularly for us, the people of this time who built the monument, who worshipped the monument, and who continued to visit the monument through thousands of years, hundreds of generations of time. And that's what we've tried to do in this exhibition, is put Stonehenge in a context of communities and people, but also to show that there's not just one Stonehenge, there's many different Stonehenges. And those monuments the monument changed and meant different things to different people at different times. And that's something we explore through the exhibition, and that I'll try and pull out in this presentation, in this talk. There's another important dimension to explore, and that is that we can't understand Stonehenge without understanding what else is happening in the wider world. And that point goes not just for the wider Stonehenge landscape, which is so connected. All the monuments in that landscape are connected in many different ways, sometimes by physical routes, sometimes by view, by sightline. So there's those aspects, but there's also what's going on across Britain, Ireland, and Europe at the same time as Stonehenge is being built, and understanding those other sites that some of us have in our backyards. People that live up or visited the Lake District will know that there's some beautiful stone circles up there, but they don't tend to get the headlines. And we wanted to bring those stories into the exhibition too. What struck us as quite remarkable is that there hadn't been an exhibition about Stonehenge or its time, its era, its world in London ever. And the only comparable exhibition that there's ever been really was in Edinburgh in 1984 and 85. So we really had opportunity, I think, to bring a story which is familiar but that hasn't been explored to the audiences who visit the museum. And when we talk of the time of Stonehenge, we're really talking about a very long time, because the monument was built and rebuilt and meant different things throughout a very long period of time. And during that period of time, some of the most important changes, social changes, cultural changes, religious changes, occurred in both Britain and Northwest Europe. And in the exhibition, we had the opportunity to connect those and talk about those and link them to the development of Stonehenge itself. And we started our narrative about 6,000 years ago with the first farmers arriving from continental Europe and bringing this new way of working the land, which is very familiar to us. In fact, it's almost quintessentially English to be a farmer, to be a farmer or be in countryside that's farmed. But it's something that was novel and was only brought here 6,000 years ago. And then about 1,000 years later, so once farming had been embedded within the culture, within the society, it's only then that you see the first Stonehenge emerging, one of many monuments that's built, not just in the Stonehenge landscape, but across Britain. And then 500 years later, so a serious, large number of generations later, you get Stonehenge being built in the form that you or I would recognize, with the silhouettes of the sarsen stones, those gateways that surround the monument today. And it's around that same time that you get the second major transformation of British and European society. And that's when metalworking is first brought into the country, again, moving from west, from east to west, from Europe to Britain. And this idea of working metal, which transforms people's ability to make objects, but more importantly, to identify and signal things like status and hierarchy, who's important, who's not. And then around 3,500 years ago, we see the third major transformation of society. And that's when long distance trade and exchange becomes a very regular feature of life, particularly in the south of England, with the flourishing of a really intense trade across the Channel. And it's at that time that we start to see Stonehenge and monuments like Stonehenge, Avebury to name one, losing their power, losing their status, and the power shifting to those coastal communities who could control the trade of precious metals, particularly, and other materials like amber across the Channel and across the North Sea. And then the exhibition ends by talking about the collapse of the society, a society that I think you can trace right back to the first farmers, this cycle of life back to the first farmers, collapses and changes at the end of the Bronze Age and the beginning of the Iron Age. So there's some really big moves in there, but it's punctuated by the story of how Stonehenge changes almost in reaction to those bigger social and cultural transformations. The exhibition has 6 parts to it, so there's 6 different sort of rooms or components to the show as you walk around it, and it's intended to take you on a journey. And on that journey, you pass through these 6 different parts of the story, segments of the story. And what I wanted to do this evening is just to touch on each of those sections, each of those parts, and just show you 1 or 2 objects to give you a flavor of the stories we're telling in the exhibition. In the first part of the exhibition, we actually go to a time before farming, when Britain was a wild wood, when there were trees almost everywhere across the British landscape, apart from certain interesting landscapes, which we'll come back to, because Stonehenge was one of those landscapes that wasn't so well wooded, wasn't so tree covered. And what you find are a group of hunter and gatherer and fisher communities who are living off the British landscape in a way that is very in tune, I think, without being too naive about it, very in tune with natural rhythms, with the migration of animals and the movement of prey that they hunt and catch. And from this remarkable site in North Yorkshire called Starcar, we have over 30 of these what we call antler frontlets. They're really to be worn on the head, so they're headdresses. And really from the recent archaeological evidence of this site, we think these objects were not functional. Some people have suggested they might have been used in hunting animals, hunting deer, so sort of take the form of a deer in order to get close so you can hunt it. But given the careful and seemingly ceremonial way in which these objects were deposited, we think they were probably used within rituals or ceremonies, allowing the people who put them on to become almost half human, half animal. And that really captures, I think, the spirit of this time. Also in the exhibition, and juxtaposed right next to that Starcar headdress, we've been able to bring this remarkable second headdress to London from Germany, a site called Bad Dürrenberg. And this is the headdress of a remarkable woman who was buried in a grave covered in red ochre, with this headdress on, but also surrounded by many different wild animal species, different birds, different mammals around her body, and the body of a young child, a baby, placed between her legs. And she's a very unusual burial and seems to be a very important woman. And what's remarkable about her story is that when archaeologists studied her anatomy, particularly the bones at the back of her skull and the top of her neck, they discovered that she had a very unusual, rare anomaly that would have meant that she at times lost consciousness, perhaps had double vision at times, pins and needles, a range of different feelings and symptoms. And we think this might have given her a certain status, power, an otherness that was seen as different and therefore powerful. And it's very interesting that around the world, we hear about shaman, these people who can communicate with wild animals and via wild animals can communicate with the spirit world. So it raises the question, was this woman one of these shamans, one of these people capable of communicating with the spirits via the wood, via the wild animals of the natural world? And Starkar and Bad Durenberg are very far apart, but they express a very shared, connected world at this time before the monuments are constructed in England. So this is a time of connectivity, and it's a time when Britain and Europe didn't exist in the way we know them. There was this land bridge that we call Doggerland that let people walk from Starkar to Bad Durenberg without getting their feet wet. And you might ask, what's this got to do with Stonehenge? Well, what I find remarkable is that even at this date, even around 8000 BC, it seems that the landscape of Stonehenge was singled out as being important, as possessing something spiritual or special to it. And if any of you visited the old Stonehenge car park, not the new one, but the old one, which was very close to the stones, you might recall that there were 3 white dots painted in the car park. And sometimes people would drive around these endlessly, thinking that they were sort of miniature roundabouts. Well, I have the truth to tell you, which is they weren't roundabouts. They were actually marking the position of posts which were erected, which were raised around 8,000 years ago, or 8,000 BC, so 10,000 years ago, in an alignment very close to where Stonehenge would be built 5,000 years later. So this is a site, this is a landscape that has huge time depth and seemingly importance to people for a very long time. But that world of which those posts are a part and the antler headdress is a part, that wooded world, comes to an end around 4000 BC, so 6,000 years ago, with the arrival of farmers from continental Europe. And this axe is a perfect example. We have 3 or 4 of these beautiful jadeite axes in the exhibition, and they're a perfect example of what these farmers carried with them when they arrived on British shores. This was both, the axe was both a symbol of the new way of life, and as well as a practical tool. The reason it was such an important symbol and tool is that to carry out the farming way of life, the wood has to be cleared, the trees have to be felled. So the axe was the sort of symbol of this new way of bringing in crops and bringing in animals and transforming the landscape in a way that we live with to this day. And this particular axe, very beautiful example, was brought all the way from the North Italian Alps, from probably a site called a mountain called Monte Viso, and people were actually climbing up to the top of these Alps to collect this particular special type of stone. And we think that that location on the mountaintops of the Alps may have given these axes even greater value, even greater power than just the pure beauty of the actual jadeite itself. It just gives you a glimpse of the type of mountain peak that people were climbing to obtain this raw material to make these axes. And we've been able to fingerprint and identify the particular sources thanks to the work of a husband and wife team called the Petricoins in France, who have spent a lifetime studying these remarkable axes and their sources. But not to be outdone, the Brits come up with their own green stone. And in this case, It's a beautiful type of stone that you find in the Lake District, from another mountain top in the Langdale Pikes, which are a beautiful set of mountains in the Lake District. And it seems that people are responding to these jadeite axes by finding a more local source that imitates the sort of basic color, the green color, but also very interestingly, can only be found at a mountain top. And Mark Edmonds, an archaeologist from York, who's done a lot of work on these axes, has pointed out that there are many other sources that would be just as useful and just as suitable to use to make axes, but people really want and desire the sources that are brought from the top of these mountaintops. So is it something about these peaks that makes them special because they're close to the heavens, close to the gods perhaps? Is it perhaps the kudos of having to climb a mountain to get your axe? What, you know, something is in that mountain that gives these axes a particular power and special quality. And we explore that story in the exhibition. And in the exhibition, we have many beautiful axes that try to give an impression of how important this time period was to transforming the landscape, but also how beautiful some of these objects were at an aesthetic level. These weren't just functional tools. People spent huge amounts of time polishing every inch of the axe. They didn't need to do that. They could just polish the cutting blade to make them effective, but they want to seemingly bring out the beauty in some of these stone sources. So I think we have to suspend our current attitude to stone, thinking it's sort of all one type of material, and imagine these people as being more like sculptors, more like someone like Henry Moore or Barbara Hepworth, people who are understanding, studying, recognizing the properties of different stone sources. And this just gives you a sense of what we've tried to do in the exhibition with our stone axes. We've included 98 stone axes from across Europe into Britain as showing the movement of agriculture, this new way of life. And we've selected 98 because that's how many generations we estimate lived during the Neolithic in Britain, from the end of the hunter-gatherer way of life to the beginning of metal. We wanted to give visitors a sense of generational time, because sometimes when I talk about thousands of years or hundreds of years, people glaze over really what we understand as humans are human time, generational time. And in the exhibition, what I found really striking is one of the objects that people have responded to most. It's not made of gold, which you might expect, or bronze, or even stone. It's actually this little leaf that is an elm leaf that fell at a site in the north of England around the time that the first farmers arrived in England. So there's an archaeological site called Windy Harbour up in Lancashire, where we can study the moment that farming comes in to the area and replaces the hunter-gatherer way of life. And this leaf comes from that layer, that archaeological layer. And to my mind, it sort of symbolizes or reflects the fragility of nature, but also this fundamental transformation that takes place at the beginning of the Neolithic. And part of that transformation is a complete recalibration of people's attitude and understanding of both time to do with the seasons. So suddenly you're linked to the agricultural calendar and not the calendar of wild animals migrating, for instance, but also a very different attitude to space and to place. Suddenly your piece of land means something, and you need to mark it, and you need to possess it, and you need to show your ownership of it. And it's at that time that we start to see the first monuments being built. Stonehenge actually comes a little bit later to the party. It's a couple of hundred years, if not 1,000 years after some of the earliest monuments that were constructed in England. But nonetheless, it's got the same qualities to it, people marking out a location where special things can happen, showing their ancestry and their connection to the landscape. And the first Stonehenge is made of a ditch and a bank, which we call the henge. And then inside that ditch and bank was a quite simple circle of blue stones that you can perhaps just make out, quite small little uprights that are right at the very edge of the inner part of that enclosure. And these blue stones are special. And in some ways, they're equivalent of the stone axes I've been talking about, just on a bigger scale, because people are bringing them from a special location that's very far away. In this case, they're bringing them from Wales and probably the mountain ranges in the west part of Wales. From the recent geological study, we've been even able to pinpoint particular quarries through the work of people like Professor Mike Parker Pearson at UCL. And these stones were brought on this remarkable journey to Salisbury Plain to be built into this monument. And people often ask me, why would anyone do that? You know, there's lots of locally available stone. Why do you want to bring these stones from so far away? And one possibility is that people are bringing a piece of their ancestral homeland with them. They've moved, they've uprooted, they've moved their community perhaps, and they're bringing with them the geology that they know and perhaps are connected to. Another possibility put forward by Mike Parker Pearson is that some of these blue stones were already constructed into monuments, into stone circles that stood in Wales. And essentially what people were doing is taking their own monuments with them to Salisbury Plain. Why they were moving is an interesting question. Could it be for political or social pressures? Could it also be because Salisbury Plain is a particularly fertile and attractive place to live as an early farmer? Both are possible. And this first Stonehenge is a cemetery. It's not just a temple for rituals. It's actually a cemetery where people are burying their dead. And remarkably, there's evidence of some of those dead who are all cremated, I should say. It's about 150 of these individuals have been discovered at the circle. And these individuals, some of them have been cremated, we think, in Wales and then brought, like the blue stones, to Stonehenge itself to be buried. And that's a really fascinating sort of human story, that I think. And what's interesting about these individuals is that they're not being buried like pharaohs or kings, as you might expect if you think about contemporary happenings in the Nile Delta and the pyramids. They're being buried in relatively egalitarian ways with relatively simple objects. And one of the most sort of precious of the objects is actually a very small little object that's in the exhibition, but very interesting. And that's this little mace head on the bottom left. And that's actually been made from a source of stone that can only be found in the northwest of Scotland. So there's long distance connections from both Wales and Scotland to this site. But what you don't see are strong evidence of a hierarchy or a strong ranking of society. And that's important given the way that society will develop as we go through time and talk about the introduction of metal. And in the second and really third parts of the exhibition, we look at the way in which these monuments like Stonehenge were connected. At this point, from about 3000 BC to 2500 BC, they're not particularly strongly connected to European happenings, but they are very much connected amongst the British Isles and Ireland. So across Britain and Ireland, very similar things are happening. And we know that because you get a very similar range of monuments, but not just that, you get a very similar type of art. So symbols, motifs, often made of geometric patterns or spirals, like this very famous example of a triple spiral from inside the tomb at Newgrange. This is a tomb aligned on the midwinter sunrise, so it lights up on midwinter as the sun rises. That's the only day of the year that you really get this full effect of the sun shining a beam into the chamber and lighting it up. And we can trace this art, this shared group of symbols across Britain and Ireland. And this is one of the most remarkable objects from this particular part of the exhibition. It's called the Knowth Macehead, and it was found deep inside one of these chambers, very similar to the Newgrange chamber I just showed you the picture of. And this is a macehead made of flint and beautifully carved with spirals and geometric patterns, possibly designed to look like a face. So you might think of Munch's Scream. It has that sort of gaping mouth, and then perhaps the spiral as the eyes. And then if you come and look at it in detail, you'll see that some of the beautiful pressure flaking on the chin area might be designed to look like a beard, and then on the top, possibly hair. So it's a really fascinating object. At a time when art is abstract, this might be one of the few representations we have of an attempt to show human form. And it's very interesting that you don't get figurative art at this time. It's not because people weren't capable. You can see that from how sophisticated this object is. It's just that there seems to be some prescriptions, some rules against showing human form in the art of the period. From Yorkshire, we get very similar motifs on very different types of objects. In this case, on these chalk cylinders. Again, you might be able to make out some faces that are hidden inside these abstract motifs on the cylinder or chalk object on the left. You see this eyebrow and eye motif, and possibly a mouth, and then the same idea on the smaller object on the right of the screen. These chalk cylinders, decorated with the same type of motifs that you find at Stonehenge and you find in Orkney and you find in Ireland, are buried not with a king or an adult even, they're buried with a small vulnerable child aged between 3 and 5 years old, as if they're protecting that child and to go to the next life, go with them to the next world. And just before we open the exhibition, incredibly excited to learn that a brand new example of this previously unique find of a chalk cylinder or drum had been found, and we were able to get it into the exhibition. It's from a site called Burton Agnes, about half a day's walk from Folkestone. And it was buried not with one child, but with 3 children in this case. So in the first burial I talked about, there were three drums or chalk cylinders with 1 child. In this new discovery, it's 1 chalk cylinder with 3 children, and they're all buried very close to one another. It's a very moving scene. If you see the photograph in the exhibition, you have 2 children, the youngest of them holding hands, and then the third, the elder of the children, protecting the 2 younger children. And this chalk cylinder placed by the head of the eldest. And then beneath the head of one of the younger children, this little chalk ball that you see on the right of the screen. I find this one of the most powerful objects despite its simplicity in this part of the exhibition, because at home I have a toddler, and I can imagine an object that size, a little ball that size, fitting perfectly into the palm of his hand. And it just, in that moment, in that thought, it almost collapses time. It almost takes you back 5,000 years to the time the bluestones were being raised across the country in Stonehenge, to a moment that connects us all, a universal moment of tragedy and of loss. And then this bone pin that probably fastened the shroud that was wrapped around these 3 vulnerable children. Shared art that connected them into the culture and the society of the time. Just to give you a better view of that new find, 3 holes have been carved in the chalk on the top of it, perhaps one hole for each child, marking out the presence of their bodies in the grave. It's not clear. We're still studying this object, and it will be published fully once the exhibition has closed. And this is a shot of all the 4 chalk cylinders or drums reunited in the exhibition. And then in Scotland, people doing their own thing, in this case, not chalk and not flint mace heads, but actually these really remarkable sculptural pieces that fit in the palm of your hand. These are called the carved stone balls, and there's a huge number of them from across Aberdeenshire into Orkney. And they're real masterpieces. They're beautiful pieces of sculpture. And in the exhibition, we've been able to bring over 20, I think the most that's ever been brought together in an exhibition of this sort, to show you the variety and the skill in producing these balls that are made of incredibly hard Scottish stone sources. And the real effort was in trying to get these, probably starting off with a cobble, it's a river cobble, trying to get them into a perfect sphere. It's a hugely time-consuming task. One of the problems that people like me, archaeologists of this time period, study this time period, face is trying to explain what things are for. We don't really know what people were doing with these objects. They're often found by farmers who are out walking or working their land, not from graves and not from particular contexts. But very recently, and in the exhibition, we have this. One of these balls has been found at a site called Ness of Brodgar in Orkney that I'll come on to in a second. And it was found underneath the floor of the house, seemingly as a sort of foundational or important deposit. So there is a sense that these objects, whatever their meaning, weren't just toys, weren't just sort of throwaway objects. They had some kind of social and cultural meaning. And in fact, the ball that's in the sort of center front of the arrangement here, the one with the spiral on top, the black one, that belonged to a very religious family in Orkney who found it on their farmland, and they took it into their house and put it in their prayer box. And every night when they prayed, they would bring out this ball and it would be held and rubbed. And so when you look at it in the exhibition, you see it's got a sheen on it, which is from people's hands rubbing away at it. And when I was explaining this to one of our reviewers, actually, who reviewed the exhibition for a national newspaper, he told me that he's a practicing Catholic and that he saw in these objects something like, on a bigger scale, I suppose, rosary beads, something that you might hold as you prayed or you meditated on some thought or idea. And I really liked that idea of what they might have been for or how they might have been used. Of course, there's many other possibilities. And then the idea that this art is from special locations has to be disrupted, because in fact, up in Orkney, we find art in people's houses. They were surrounded by it in their everyday lives. And we've been very lucky to be able to bring a number of these decorated objects from new excavations at the settlement site of Ness of Brodgar, which, if any of you know Orkney, is nestled very close between two huge stone circles, the Stones of Stonehenge and the Ring of Brodgar. And the Ness of Brodgar is a little sort of bridge, land bridge, that connects the two amazing henge stone circle sites. And on this land bridge was this very important settlement that seems to be part living place, partly somewhere that people lived, but also a ceremonial site as well, where rituals and ceremonies were undertaken. So a very interesting site. And in the exhibition, we have some of these architectural features from these houses. So people were using red and yellow stone sources to create alternating patterns within their houses. So this is really very sophisticated architecture 5,000 years ago, a time we tend to think that people were living in very simplistic houses. People were actually up in Orkney living in very solid and impressive stone houses. We've been able to bring some of these pieces from Orkney down to London and put them on display for the first time, certainly in the mainland. And towards the end of the time period I've been talking about with this art, shared art, around 2500 BC, you see the second phase of Stonehenge really crystallizing. And what we see there are the Saracen stones being brought to the site. In this case, they're not brought from particularly far away, about 30, 40 kilometers. But what's impressive about them is the sheer size of the Saracens that are brought, sort of tons, 60 tons at least, some of these stones brought in and raised up, and not only raised up, but worked. And so we know that they were roughing out these Saracens at the quarry sites, but then a lot of the work to shape them into these sort of very regular, and probably very regular when they were new Saracen stones, a lot of that work was actually done at the site by pounding and pounding and pounding at these stones. And if, as has happened recently, you open up a little trench in this Stonehenge landscape immediately around the circle, you come down on a whole layer that's like the moon. It's covered in these Saracen chips, and it's covered in what we call hammer stones that were used to pound and pound and pound at the Saracens. So we have to try and imagine the circle not as we experience it today, sort of sanitized and cordoned off as it has to be to protect it. We have to try and imagine the circle as a dynamic, active, exciting place to be, dangerous place to be, because if one of these stones topples and there's no health and safety, you're going to be you're going to be in serious trouble. So a really a different view of the monument. And we try and explore this in exhibition by showing some of these hammerstones. In other words, in some ways, these hammerstones are the paintbrushes that an artist used to paint the Mona Lisa. These are the tools that people spent hours and hours and hours using to shape these iconic saracens and make this form. And what they were ultimately doing is building a monument that was aligned on key moments in the solar year. In particular, the summer solstice sunrise and the winter solstice sunset. Those two key moments that people still gather at Stonehenge to observe. And really, it's the winter solstice, we think, based on the archaeology of the wider landscape and the deposits that people made of particularly feasting material. It's the winter solstice, we think, that was the most important time of the year. And that's because these were farmers, and for the sun to return was everything. It guaranteed that you were going to have another year of food, of survival. So that was probably the most important time at Stonehenge, not, as we've come to sort of believe, the midsummer sunrise. So we couldn't bring Stonehenge to the exhibition. That will come as no surprise to anyone. I normally make a joke here about the English heritage paperwork, but really we couldn't do it, but we did want to bring a monument, a circle, to the British Museum. And we were very lucky that our colleagues in King's Lynn let us bring some of the key components of this astonishing monument called Stonehenge to the British Museum. And Stonehenge was discovered in the late 1990s, peeping out of the shoreline on the north coast of Norfolk. And it had been there, it had been submerged and hidden and preserved since 2049 BC, probably the spring or summer of 2049 BC. And we know that because of the tree ring analysis by Maisie Taylor and Francis Pryor. So a fantastic preservation of a monument, but also a reminder that it's not just stone that was used to build monuments at this time. In fact, to go back to Stonehenge, there are many monuments in the wider Stonehenge landscape that were built of wood, but that just don't survive other than as a post hole. So here on the coast of Norfolk, we have a rare example of a survival of one of these wooden circles that was constructed at this time. And in the exhibition, we've tried to give a sense of how it might have looked. Of course, a lot of the oak has been lost from the top, so it was probably about twice, if not 3 times as high as these posts show. But what people would have seen as they approached Stonehenge was tightly packed posts, tighter than we've been able to show them in the exhibition, but tightly packed posts that appeared to the person approaching as if they were approaching a giant oak tree. So the bark on the outside of the wood. And then once they got inside the monument through a very narrow doorway, they would have encountered a giant oak tree that had been turned upside down so that its roots pointed up towards the heavens. We're not exactly clear what people were doing. Were they creating an altar on which they could put things, perhaps even human remains, bodies, or were they trying to create a space within that circle where the underworld beneath the land could be accessed, could be reached? In other words, creating a place in the world that accessed the below powers of perhaps a supernatural place beneath the land. It's a very interesting dilemma and question. But the doorway of the monument, which we can see here in the center of the shot, all that's left of that doorway, was aligned on the midsummer sunrise just at Stonehenge. So in the exhibition, we have a really, I think, quite beautiful sun that rises and sets as you visit the exhibition. And we've aligned that sun on the doorway to give you a sense of how it appeared in 2049 BC. But that world of monuments and of communal monuments was really transformed forever and changed, and people stopped building circles and monuments around the time that metal was introduced to Britain, and that's about 4,500 years ago. What's very interesting is some of the earliest examples of gold that come into Britain, some of the earliest examples of metal are gold, and they are designed to reflect and celebrate the power of the sun. So the sun is going from something that's monuments are aligned to something that is being celebrated by using objects that could only be possessed by a limited number of people. So we see the beginnings of an emergence of social hierarchy or differences in types of people within society. And we have some really beautiful examples in an exhibition of these very early gold necklaces that we call lunula. It's probably the biggest assemblage of these objects that's been put together out with Ireland. And these are from both Britain and Ireland. And in the same part of the exhibition, we have this remarkable object called the Nebra sky disk. And the Nebra sky disk is perhaps one of the most important objects from the ancient world. It's important because it is a kind of, to be very crude about it, it is a portable Stonehenge. It encodes astronomical and solar information. So the first point to make is that in the center of the disk, around the sort of 1 o'clock position, there's a grouping of 7 gold disks that we think of as stars. And we associate these with the Pleiades constellation, or a cluster, I should say. It's not a constellation, it's a cluster, the 7 sisters. And the appearance and disappearance of this cluster is closely associated with the beginning and end of the farming calendar in sort of folklore and history communities right across Europe. So they're a very important group of stars for farming communities. That's the first point. And it's the first time that a star grouping is ever shown in an accurate way on an actual object. So that gives it a world sort of first. And then on the edges of the disc, there's a gold band on the right, and there's a space for one on the left that's now missing. And these mark out a very particular angle of 83 to 84 degrees. And that's exactly the range that the sun would have risen and set at this particular point in Germany. So it's marking the different positions of the sun between midsummer sunrise and midwinter sunset. So it's a kind of portable version of that alignment that you saw built into monuments like Stonehenge and Seahenge. Another point to make about it, and I could give you 45 minutes just on the disc, but another really interesting point that connects it back to the Stonehenge story is that, like much of the gold that's used in England, the gold that decorates this object comes from Cornwall and is traded and moved and exchanged all the way to Germany at this point, 3,600 years ago. And in the same part of the exhibition, we have some really remarkable objects that reflect the way in which gold was used to create objects that showed solar symbolism and that allowed individuals to be seen as different and special. These are a series of gold hats, we think, that were worn probably only for special events, given how I don't want to say how silly you would look, but certainly how difficult it would be to move around freely while wearing one. And we actually have 2 of these remarkable gold hats in the exhibition, this one from France and the other one I showed you from Germany, decorated in a very similar way to gold that you do find in Britain. And in Scandinavia, further north, people develop a very rich series of myths and stories about the sun's passage and journey across the sky that includes stories of how mythical animals pull the sun across the heavens. These are some of the most enjoyable objects, I think, in this part of the exhibition because they're quite playful. They show the horse, the snake, the fish, and their role in pulling the sun around the world in the course of a day. As you can see, some of these objects are almost amusing in the way in which they combine the features of horse and snake. And also on the left, you see this sort of double-headed god. So you get a real sense of a rich mythology that we can't fully understand, but that we tend to think of as something that happens much, much later in history. But here we have it in the early part of the Metal Ages in Europe. And then in the penultimate part of the exhibition, we come back down to earth with a bump. And here we explore the way in which the landscape around Stonehenge starts to become a cemetery. So the monument crystallizes and sets a bit like sort of Westminster Abbey once it's finished, but it doesn't lose its meaning. People still want to be associated with it. And that association takes the form of burial. So this is a group of objects that were buried with a man close to Stonehenge. We call him the Amesbury Archer. He's a very interesting individual. We know from studying his teeth that he wasn't born on the chalklands of southern England. In fact, he wasn't born in Britain at all. He was very likely born in the foothills of the Alps. But in his lifetime, he made this pilgrimage, this journey across Europe to Britain, where he was buried with all these rich offerings. And amongst his grave goods are some of the earliest examples of metal of anywhere in Britain. He has these little copper daggers that are very early and small in form. And on the left, bottom left, little gold ornaments that he probably wore in his hair, like gold scrunchies. So this is someone who is buried with metal. He's also buried with a little black stone at the back next to the pot, a little black stone. That was used probably as an anvil on which to work metal. So he's probably a metal worker, and that likely gave him a degree of status and importance at this time. And in the exhibition, we've been able to bring these gravestones that show archers. There's this, it's quite an abstract form, but there's actually a bow and an arrow shown on this gravestone, and then the sort of semi-abstract head or of this figure. And these gravestones were raised in the homeland of the Amesbury archer. So it's been really nice to bring this archer from his homeland together with his grave, with his offerings, with his grave goods, to kind of reunite them after 4,500 years. And as the centuries pass, Stonehenge becomes the location of some of the most interesting and important and special burials of anywhere in Europe. And one of the most important in the exhibition is this chap, who's buried with a range of gold objects. He's called the Bush Barrow Chief. And the point to make about him is he represents the beginning of the end for Stonehenge, because in amongst his rich offerings are these bronze daggers, and they are not British objects. They are very likely imports from France, from Brittany, and they're very similar to other objects that are found in Germany and even in the Mediterranean world, in the Mycenaean world. So this is someone who's closely connected to trade and exchange across Europe. And this is what begins to happen as Stonehenge loses its power. The sea routes of southern England become alive with boats crossing to and from as bronze production really booms in continental Europe. And the boom of that bronze reaches these shores, boats coming to England carrying these cargoes of bronze. And amazingly, we have some of these boats because they sank. One off the coast of Dover, a site called Langdon Bay, full of French bronzes on their way probably into England, judging from the other objects that are on board. So cross-channel trade and connections. And with this rise in trade and connections in the Stonehenge landscape and across Britain, you start to see people knuckling down as the tensions begin to emerge, as they tend to do when people are trading and exchanging precious objects. There becomes the opportunity for conflict and for violence. And it's at this time that we see the type of objects that you might be familiar with if you've read Homer, if you've read the Iliad, or if you've read the Odyssey, these warriors going to battle with one another. This is the time period of Homer when these warriors emerge. And in the exhibition, we've been able to show those warriors, but we've also been able to show the grim reality of conflict by bringing this remarkable battlefield, or finds from this remarkable battlefield in Talence in Germany, around a river valley where bronze is being circulated and exchanged. There was a huge battle. 20,000 disarticulated human remains have been found at this site, and many of the bones show evidence of really severe and savage conflict, brutal conflict that shows the way in which war and conflict have always been very depressing and very negative forces in society. But we didn't want to end the exhibition, I don't want to end the talk, thinking about the way in which Stonehenge descends into a kind of anarchy, although that is part of the story, that is part of the historical narrative. But there is also some reasons to be cheerful. And towards the end of the Metal Ages, across the Stonehenge landscape and beyond, you start to see greater evidence of settlement and of the house as a place of gathering. So the monuments are no longer built, but the house becomes a place of gathering, of feasts, of community life. And in the exhibition, we've been able to bring some finds from a new discovery of a wonderful settlement, a community on the Cambridgeshire Fens, a site called Must Farm that was built on stilts on the English Fens, so on the sort of above the water. And about a year after the settlement was built, it was burnt down, possibly intentionally, and all the houses and all their objects crashed or plummeted into the fens below, and the objects were preserved. So we have the wood and the textiles from those houses, and it lets us recreate what it was like to live at this time in one of these roundhouses. And on the left, you'll see a little bobbin of nettle fibre that's been wrapped around this dogwood stick. And in these houses, you have all the ingredients, all the components of a textile factory, really, people producing very high quality textiles for local consumption. And then on the right, beads that are brought from as far away as Turkey and even Egypt into England. So story of a community that's becoming both connected to the bigger parts of the bigger story of what's happening in Europe, but also one where environmental change and conflict are beginning to bring society down, to see a disintegration in society. And that's how we close the exhibition with this beautiful object from the Shropshire Marches that comes from the very end of the time period that we're looking at in the exhibition, about 800 BC. And this is a time when the archaeological record goes very dark indeed. It feels like society has been really at war with one another, and the soil has been depleted. It's been farmed now for thousands of years. Areas like Stonehenge have been carved up and fortified in places. So society is really in a quite dark place. And this object is thrown into a bog about 800 BC in the Shropshire Marshes, possibly as an offering, as a sacrifice to try and stop this transformation of the landscape that's happening, this deterioration of the landscape that's happening through population pressure, but also through climate change. And this object represents really that end point, but it also represents three things that I hope have come across in the course of the talk. And those three things are the importance of the sun. We think this object is decorated with a sort of stylized setting or rising sun. And the sun really is the guiding star of people's religion, but also more practically of their everyday life. The timing and tempo of their agricultural life is built around the solar year, around the midwinter and midsummer points. And then secondly, creativity. This is a time when life was hard. People didn't have a lot of time, and yet they made the time to make some really beautiful objects. And I hope that's come across in some of the images I've shown you and some of the objects in the exhibition. These are very sophisticated objects, very special. And then thirdly, connectivity. This type of object, this little gold pendant, and it is really very small. My image makes it seem massive, but it's a little pendant you'd wear around your neck. It is a type of object that you find in Ireland, but that you also find in the Mediterranean world. And this is a point I try and get across as well in the exhibition and talks I've given about it. We tend to think about this time period as quite an insular one, when people didn't stray far from their settlement, but actually people are constantly voyaging, people are restless, people are undertaking long distance migrations and movements all the time during this time period. So it's a story of connections and of connectivity as well. And I'll just close with a line that we have in the very close of the exhibition, which is that every age has the Stonehenge it deserves or desires. And I hope that's something that we haven't been too prescriptive about, and I haven't been tonight. That really, it's not for me to tell you or anyone what to make of Stonehenge. Everyone has their own version of it and what it means to them. And something we hope people will leave with are the ingredients to think about their place in Britain's story, as it's been for the last 6,000, 8,000 years, and their own responses to what they've seen and the changes that have taken place across that time period. So I will stop talking. I'll leave with this slide that is not very modest, just to show that we did get some good reviews when we opened the exhibition. I'll stop talking, and if anyone does have any questions, I'm obviously very pleased to answer any.